wars, and we studied the First World War, the Second World War, very much the Vietnam and the Korean War. But those wars were governed by rules. The Geneva Convention, for example, which introduced in 1864, where they had 12 signatories to it, and that was followed by the end of the Second World War. There were nearly 200 signatories to the Geneva Convention, albeit some countries disregarded the rules, and we had things like the Nuremberg trials for the offences committed against soldiers in the Second World War. But there were rules, and they tended to be abided by, and it was something to work with. But as the last century came to a close, we started to enter a period where people didn't abide by those rules. We'd got the Second World War, and obviously I come from a country where we had bombing, and that was a traditional war. But very much as the century drew to a close, certainly in the UK, that was Manchester in 1996, we start to saw the tactics that were perhaps used by the resistance in France during the Second World War, where we had people attacking the infrastructure of the country in a non-traditional way. That's the car bomb in Manchester. And obviously, 2005, we had a number of bombs that you'll be aware of on the traffic infrastructure in London, on the underground and on buses. But I'm aware that we're not the only ones in the UK to suffer from that sort of attack, as people in the audience from America will all remember 9/11. So they're the sort of background that I'm talking about. But there is still normal war going on. The vast amounts of money is now spent on cyber war. We've got probably, I would call it arm's length war, with things like drones. I mean, there are drones attacking places in the Middle East where the pilot is actually sat in England, in Lincolnshire. We've now got troops with their own personal issue drone to make it safer. But there is still traditional warfare we've seen in more recent years in Ukraine. So there is war, but it's not that sort of war that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about a secret war that gets the police service involved in the UK. The only training that I had for war when I was a young police officer was what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. So it was what we were going to do in those 4 minutes, which generally was have a cup of tea and get under a table. But things started to change, and we had to adapt our techniques for policing as the way that war changed. There are two incidents that I'll start to talk about from the 1980s, and they are the where were you when. And the first one, which I'll go into detail about on the left, is the raid on the Iranian embassy in London, near to Princess Gate, near to Royal Albert Hall, anybody that's been to London. And that's probably might not be as well known by some of the passengers from abroad. And I'll go into that. And that's the killing of a policewoman on the streets of London in 1984, Yvonne Fletcher. So I'll go into some detail now. That's the Iranian embassy in London. I say it's on Princess Gate, a short distance from the Royal Albert Hall. And on a morning, and it was the 30th of April, 1980, it was any other day, normal day, when 4 or 6 young men, smartly dressed, burst through the front door of the embassy. Taking by surprise, that gentleman there, that's PC Trevor Locke. He was the only officer on duty. If you visit London today, you'll probably see heavily armed police officers with submachine guns. In those days, there was one police officer in normal police uniform. He had got a sidearm that was under his anorak, his coat. He was actually having a cup of tea in the entrance that the caretaker had just made him. He was actually just standing inside the area just there. And he attempted to try and stop them, but they charged past him and they took over the embassy. Their request was that for a small area of Iran, a province called Khuzestan, is that it got its own sovereignty. There were people in prisons in Iran from that area, they be released, and then they get safe passage out of the country. It was at the time when our Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher and the Home Secretary was William Whitelaw. At the very outset, Margaret Thatcher made it perfectly clear that nobody was going anywhere. And that was the sort of Prime Minister she was. And that was the task that was set for the Metropolitan Police, is these people will be arrested and they'll be dealt with under British law. They won't be released. We have a place in London, in Whitehall, called Cobra, where when we get an emergency incident like this, they set COBRA up. I thought it was named after a snake, and it isn't. It's Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, and that's COBRA, and that's under Downing Street in London. And that was set up with all the experts as how they would deal with it. And very early on, the military were introduced into the equation, and we have an organisation, an army unit in the UK called the Special Air Service. I guess it's equivalent to the American Navy SEALs. We have a special boat squadron, which is made up from the Navy and Marines, but we also have the Special Air Service. So they were put on notice that they could well be required in London through official channels, also through unofficial channels, because one of the first officers to arrive on scene, a dog handler, a K9 handler, you call him in America, he was a former member of the SAS, and he rang his colleagues down in Hereford, where they're based, and said, I think you're going to be needed up here. So B Squadron of the SAS very quickly started to travel up to London, and they went first to an army barracks in London, and then they went to a premises adjoining the Iranian embassy. One was the Ethiopian embassy, and another was a college for the Royal College of Physicians, which was also adjacent to the Iranian embassy. And they started to prepare for the inevitable, I think, really, we know that. They wanted to hear what the hostage takers were saying in the building. That's important so you can get your tactics together. Very quickly, they cut the TV aerial wire and they cut the phone wires, because we could do that in 1980. But of course, the problem the police service face today in a siege is that people have got a mobile phone and there's 24-hour rolling news, and no longer can you block those signals, because if you turn off the signal for the hostage taker's phone, you turn off the signal for the security services phones as well. So that was something we could do back in the 80s. We could just cut the wires. They started to drill through the wall of the Iranian embassy so they could put listening devices in, but they needed to cover the sound of that. So one of the utility companies at the time, British Gas, they got them to start digging the road up outside the embassy to cover the sound. But the hostage takers got fed up with that, and they said, will you stop digging the road up? So they did. So very cleverly, they contacted Heathrow Airport and said, will you divert all flights into and out of Heathrow to a lower altitude to fly over the embassy, so the aircraft engine noise would cover the sound of the drilling through the wall. PC Locke actually told the hostage takers that it was actually mice and the embassy was overrun with mice. Again, the scratching, but that was the security services putting the listening devices through the wall. They did initially allow 3 of the hostages to go. One was a lady who was pregnant. One was someone who was ill. And actually, this one appeals to me. One of the hostages snored so loudly that it upset the hostage takers, so they let him go. So actually, for someone who snores, actually, I think that's a rather good technique. Snore and you'll get released by the hostage takers. So that's in the background. They're starting to get the evidence. Trevor Locke refused to eat the PC that was there, because if he had something to eat, he would need to go to the toilet and take his jacket off, and the hostage takers would see his gun. So he refused food for the 6 days. He had liquids, but that didn't require him when he went to the toilet to take his coat off. And when they said, why aren't you going to the toilet, why aren't you taking your coat off? He said, because I need to preserve the image of a British bobby. And that's why he kept his coat on all the time. Bless him. However, things took a turn for the worse on the night of the 5th of May, when the hostage takers were not getting what they wanted. And Margaret Thatcher had made it clear they weren't going to get what they wanted. So they killed the press attaché at the Iranian embassy, Mr. Abbas Lavasani. And at that point, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir David McNee, contacted William Whitelaw and said, can we have the help of the military who were already in place, as I've said. I've actually seen that document. It's in the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard. It's a hastily written piece of paper that they did in the street outside the embassy. And as you can, it's got Princess Gate on. And that's where the senior police officer, John Dello, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, signs over the embassy to the military. So the embassy effectively becomes a war zone for that period of time. Once it's handed over, it's called military aid to the civilian police, and it's just an agreement that we'd have, usually in things like flooding and natural disaster, but this is where we sign it over to the military to take action. What the hostage takers didn't realise is that the SAS had been preparing to abseil down the building, covered by the noise of the low-flying aircraft, and they'd secured ropes to the chimneys at both the back and the front of the embassy. The ones that a lot of people in Britain will remember is the front of the embassy, where the SAS threw grenades through the front of the windows before they prepared to go in. What a lot of people don't know is that they had to do it quicker than they intended, because the troops that abseiled down the back of the building, one of them lost his grip and put his foot through a window and alerted the hostage takers that they were there. So they had to just put a little bit more haste into it, and they went into the embassy. Very quickly, they killed 5 of the 6 hostage takers. The 6th one was arrested and served 27 years in prison for being a terrorist. There was, sadly, was Mr. Levancy, the press secretary, was killed, and 2 of the hostages were seriously injured. But they all escaped. Well, the others all escaped with the life. The actual rescue took 17 minutes. I've done tabletop exercises and practical exercises with the SAS as part of my training, and I salute them for their bravery and their skills. Tremendous group of people, and we don't know where we'd be without them on that occasion. And this guy as well, he got his just rewards as well. He got the George Medal from the Queen, which is the 2nd highest civilian award that you can get in the UK. And he went on to be a very, very successful lecturer on a course that's run in London. An American FBI come on the course. It's about hostage negotiation, and he was a very, very welcome member of that course. So that's the background. That was Operation Nimrod. I said I'd cover the case. 4 years later, we have a situation in London where we've got the Libyan embassy. Call it embassy, the ambassador had been recalled to Libya. And there'd been a number of incidents under Gaddafi's regime where dissidents in Manchester and London had been attacked, there'd been bombs, and people in the UK, or Libyan people in the UK, were generally very upset about the way that Gaddafi was ruling Libya. So they planned a protest outside the Libyan embassy in London. The people, or the student committee that was running the embassy in London, were very unhappy about that, and they said, we want the protest banned. There is a right of protest in the UK, and the police explained to the people at the embassy building, we can't ban it. People have a right to protest in the UK. What they didn't know at this time, and it was only later when they examined intercepts from GCHQ, which is the government secret listening establishment in Cheltenham, when they reviewed those intercepts, they actually would have known the Libyans were asking permission to open fire on the protesters outside the embassy. Sadly, they only realised that after the event when they reviewed the intercepts. But that's Yvonne Fletcher. She was born in 1958. She would now happily be, if she'd lived, would be drawing her old age pension. Who knows, could have been on a cruise like this. But she was one of the 30 unarmed officers that went to protect and restrain the protesters outside the embassy that morning. And as I said, there were about 75 protesters, very little trouble, and like her colleagues, including her fiancé that was on the same duty, they were standing there until 10:18 on that morning, when one of these people, or 2 of these people, opened fire on the crowd. But the shots sadly hit PC Fletcher, and within a few minutes she was carried into a side street and then taken to a local hospital where she was declared dead. And then we've now got another siege where we've got people in the embassy who are refusing to come out. They claim diplomatic immunity, and those that you know anything about, a little bit about the law, will know that if you've got diplomatic immunity, there is nothing that the host law enforcement agency can do against you. It's the Libyan embassy is effectively classed as a piece of Libya. So the police put a containment on it. They tried to persuade the people to come out and give themselves up, but they knew the law, and they said, there's nothing you can do. We've got diplomatic immunity. Can you organise for us to leave the country? So a few mornings later, in fact on the 27th of April, 2 things happened that day. Yvonne's fiancé disregarded the rules that had been set, and under the cover of darkness, he crawled into the street to recover a hat so it could go on the top of her coffin for her funeral that was taking place later that day. And a short while later, the people that had done the killing and the other people inside the embassy were led out of the embassy into waiting vehicles, and they were taken to an airport and they were flown out to Libya. Subsequent inquiries after the diplomatic relations improved with Libya identified that 2 men had been responsible. Only one was alive, and there was sufficient evidence to prosecute that person because he hadn't got diplomatic immunity due to his role. And if the police had got the containment on earlier, he could have been arrested and could have been dealt with in the normal way. Papers were put forward for trial in 2017. However, a lot of the prosecution evidence relied on material that had come from the security services. There is a protocol in the UK that if it's evidence that's come via the security services and might expose people to danger, that evidence can't be used. So sadly, there's never been a prosecution for the killer of Yvonne Fletcher. One thing that came out of it was, I don't know if people remember the film director, film producer, Michael Winner. Well, Michael Winner set a thing up called the Police Memorial Trust. And from that day, any police officer that falls is remembered by a memorial. And actually, it's backdated. These officers that were killed 100 years ago now have had a memorial placed, usually at the spot where they lost their life. And that's down to the film director, Michael Winner. And the first one was for Yvonne Fletcher. So they're, in a sense, the ones that I've covered are about little spats between countries. Although a police officer gets killed, it's very much about countries. Let's look about rogue nations actually killing people on the streets of the UK. I'm going to go back in time slightly to 1978, and that's Georgy Markov, who was a Bulgarian journalist who'd fled Bulgaria in 1968 because of what he said about the Russian-backed Bulgarian regime. He was on his way to work one morning, and he was on Westminster Bridge going to a bus stop when he felt what he thought was an insect bite him on the right thigh. Didn't think any about it, went into work, didn't feel too well that night, in fact got a raging fever. They took him into hospital and he never recovered. And the reason he didn't recover, because that insect bite was in fact a small metal ball that contained ricin, and it had got sugar over the holes, and the body temperature actually melted the sugar and allowed the ricin, which there's no known antidote, to get into his bloodstream. About 10 days previously, a similar attack had been carried out on another Bulgarian dissident on the French metro system. A few years later, a Russian defector, Oleg Kudyotskin, he says, not looking at his notes, actually explained how it had been done. And it was done with an umbrella. And the assassin would have walked up behind him, put the umbrella against his leg and fired the pellet. The Metropolitan Police have actually got a replica in their museum, which I've seen, and that's how he was killed. There were inquiries into it at the time, and nobody was found to have done it. However, in 2021, this guy, that's 2 photographs, as he was in 2021 on the one on the right, as he was in 1968. Anybody watched The Jackal recently, the TV series, you know, about the assassin? Well, he could well have been the Jackal of the day. That gentleman is a Danishman of Italian descent, Francesco Giuliano, and he gave interviews to a DV company in 2021 about his role. He was in London at the time, and he was actually a hitman for the Bulgarian Secret Service. Shortly after he'd given the interview, he was found dead in his apartment. They said it was a heart attack, and I'm sure it was, but there we go, coincidence. There is a memorial to Mr. Markov in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. And so probably say that he was one of the first dissidents from a foreign country to be killed on the streets of England by the Secret Service, or a hired killer on behalf of the Secret Service. But I'm going to jump forward a bit now, and here's why I have to give a bit of a government health warning. I'm going to be talking a lot about this gentleman here, Mr. Putin, and this is where I get a bit uneasy, because a lot of people that say anything against Mr. Putin end up falling off of balconies or dying of heart attacks. So anything that I now say in future, it's for a friend. I didn't really write it. Somebody else wrote it, not me. But Putin started off, or had made his first part of his career in the KGB, where he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Then he left the KGB and he went into politics, and he was actually the deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, a regular calling point for cruise ships that were doing the Baltic. And that's where he started to get his real power. People would say that he was actually the real power behind the mayorship in St. Petersburg. What happened in St. Petersburg at the time was mass corruption. You'd have situations where foreign companies would order timber, they'd order grain, they would pay for it, it would be shipped out of St. Petersburg. Well, it certainly was shipped out on paper. The suggestion is it never actually left St. Petersburg. He was involved in the corruption there. There was drug running. If you wanted to open a business in St. Petersburg, then you needed Mr. Putin's permission to open that business. He actually went on, when he'd been the mayor of St. Petersburg, he did actually return to the security service. He went on to be the head of, they rebranded the KGB. They needed a new name for it. They called it the FSB, but it was still the KGB, just say rebranded. They obviously got an advertising agency and paid them millions of rubles and gave it a new name. But Mr. Putin was starting to get his real power there. There was an estimate by Fortune magazine that 2 years ago he was worth £200 billion. Forgive me, I haven't done the conversion into dollars. It's probably a lot more than that. It's suggested that he's the richest man in Europe, therefore cannot afford to fall from power in Russia because it would expose how he's made his money. He made his money a lot through the oligarchs, because at the time, you may remember, it was a bit of a wild west for business in Russia at that time. As it had moved away from communism and they were starting to open the country up to business, then it was, well, somebody said, rather than reading a management document, you'd be better off reading the history of the mafia to actually work out how things were working in Russia at the time. I've got to introduce another actor into this play, and this is Boris, he said, looking at his notes to get his pronounce his surname right, Boris Berezovsky. I'm going to call him Boris because that's a lot easier. Boris was a very, very wealthy oligarch. And his first contact with Putin came when he wanted to open a new Mercedes dealership in St. Petersburg. So he had to speak to Putin, and Putin gave him permission to open the dealership, the Mercedes dealership. If he hadn't have done, it would have failed. They would have made sure of it, that it failed. But a very, very powerful man. But he was just one of many oligarchs that were starting to court the favours of Putin. Anybody know this guy? Abramovich, Roman Abramovich, used to own Chelsea Football Club, soccer club in London. He was a very, very, at that time, a very close friend of Boris's, and again, courting Putin. Abramovich is still seen as a friend of Putin. That might be to do with the fact that he bought Putin a luxury yacht. It looks more like the ship, doesn't it, than a yacht, but that's what he did to court the favours of Putin. But they weren't alone. There were lots of other oligarchs that were courting the favours of Putin. In particular, these two, Abramovich and Boris, they were doing deals to do with oil and energy companies in the sort of wild west that Russia was becoming. But importantly, Boris also owned Channel One, the main, or one of the main TV channels in Russia at the time, which allowed him, firstly, he was part of the power that got Yeltsin in, and at this time Yeltsin is still president, Putin's not president yet. He'd got Yeltsin in power by using Channel One. He'd also organised for a very glossy autobiography to be written about Yeltsin. So it wasn't long, when he realised Yeltsin probably wasn't long for power, that he needed to make sure that Putin possibly could be the next president. And he did that by telling Putin that Channel One was available to him, and also he'd get a very glossy autobiography written about Putin. And Boris wasn't wrong, because he wanted to look after himself, and he realised that obviously that Putin was going to be in power, and by this time Putin had gone back to Moscow, and he was head of the FSB, the KGB rebranded organisation, and he thought he could trust him. He thought he could trust Vladimir Putin. He's a good guy, one he could work with. And so he thought things were really quite hunky-dory. In that time, Putin stepped down as head of the FSB, and he became the prime minister to Yeltsin. So he's gone back into politics after a short time in the security services. But Boris thought he was a good guy. He'd got integrity. It was the car bomb under Boris's car that probably should have been a red flag to him, that things weren't what they could be. There was an assassination attempt on Boris. And he'd no idea, didn't he? He didn't think it could be Putin. But the investigation into the car bombing was headed by that young-looking guy there, a young investigator called Alexander Litvinenko. You probably not recognise him there, but I will come back to Alexander Litvinenko in a minute. But he won the sort of favours from Boris. There's some suggestion that Boris started to pay money to organise his private security, because having had one car bombing, he thought it could well be the subject of another car bombing. And the trust built up between Alexander and Boris, and Alexander came to him, he says, I'm working in the FSB and I'm not quite sure whether we can trust the FSB. And he said, why is that? He said, I've come across a list of names of people that are going to be assassinated, and you're on that list. So Boris naively said, look, I'm mates with Putin, and I'll organise for you to speak to Putin, because he'll probably be able to find out who's behind this list. Alexander agreed to do a TV interview on live TV on Channel 1, which Boris owns, and at the side of him were three other men with black hoods on who were FSB agents, and they said that, look, we've been tasked with assassinating people, and Alexander, again, probably naively, thinking he's got the backing of Boris, who's friends with Putin, that he's safe. Well, what we now know is probably he wasn't safe, because it was Putin that was behind those attacks, because he wanted to claw back the industries that the oligarchs had started to sell. Yeltsin said that he was going to resign as suspected, and that Putin was in the ideal position to take his place. But Putin wanted to step up to the mark and shown to be a bit of a hard guy, not an administrator. And the perfect opportunity came when some Chechnya rebels blew up apartment blocks in Moscow. However, Alexander came forward and said, well, I have evidence that actually the Secret Service in Russia has blown those apartments up. And Putin's using that attack as an excuse to attack a foreign nation or a state, Chechnya. So he wants to raise his profile, Putin, by attacking another country. I wonder if he'd use that again, but anyway, we've got it with Chechnya. Boris was on holiday in Spain, and somebody came to see him in Spain and said, Boris, don't go back to Russia, because you'll be dead if you go back. There's some suggestion that was put to him that he'd been involved in a corrupt deal with a fellow businessman to buy out Aeroflot, the Russian national airline. So he did as he was told, and he came to what became known as Londongrad, where a lot of the oligarchs started to move to London and buy up entire blocks of houses, very palatial homes. And as I've said, Abramovich bought himself a football club as well. But they needed the help of movers and shakers in London to achieve this. And they started to call in people that knew how to do business. One of them was this guy, Scott Young, and he's described on paper as a property and technology entrepreneur. I would suggest he was a money launderer, and his job was to bring in the Russian money and clean it and put it back into circulation and get the oligarchs' money out of Russia and back into banks in London. So he's putting his head above the parapet, is our Mr. Scott Young. But sadly, he appears to have committed suicide by jumping off a balcony at his apartment and impaling himself on railings. So he's dead now out the way. The oligarchs used a very niche solicitors firm in Mayfair to continue moving their money out of Russia some of it by Arab countries, by United Arab Emirates. One of the partners in that business was Stephen Curtis, real high-flying, very wealthy lawyer in London. So wealthy, he'd got an enormous house in Dorset on the south coast, which he used to fly to and from in his helicopter, which of course crashed on his way home one night, his brand new helicopter. I haven't got a photograph of his business partner, Stephen Moss, and he was found dead from a heart attack at 46. So we've now got a situation where people working behind the scenes to assist the oligarchs were dying, sometimes inexplicably. Remember Alexander Litvinenko, the very trusted investigator from the FSB that started to be friendly with Boris, and he put his head above the parapet to say, look, I think people are trying to kill oligarchs in Moscow. Well, he also stood up for that lady there. She's was a journalist in Russia. That's Anna, and he said, I am going to have to look at my notes on this occasion. Anna Politskaya, she was a journalist who also criticised Putin for the apartments and also suggesting he was involved in drug running. For Putin, sadly, she didn't die when they tried to poison her on an Aeroflot flight, and she survived that. But she didn't survive the assassin that was waiting outside her apartment door in Moscow. Alexander Litvinenko started to point the finger again at Putin for that. By this time, Boris has managed to get Alexander smuggled out of Russia, and he's now living in London, and he's working as a journalist. But some of you may remember that photograph of him, because he ended up in London, we say dead man walking, because he's there and he's going to die, and he knows he's going to die, because he's had polonium given to him, and there's no known antidote. And research done by the British government's chemical research laboratory said that the known source of polonium is the Russian military. There is no other source for it. So he's died of that. I've actually been to his grave in Highgate Cemetery. He's buried in a lead-lined coffin. They said they wouldn't be able to cremate him for 20 years. I was there about 18 months ago, I took that photograph, and he was buried. There was no immediate inquest, but they set up an investigation, and it's quite a unique investigation. And I can't imagine being the detective inspector in the Metropolitan Police in London when you're told you can go and speak to the murder victim because he's still alive. He's not going to live, but he's going to die. So they started to talk to Alexander Litvinenko to find out what had happened to him. And he'd been to meet an associate, a friend, at a restaurant in Piccadilly in London. And this friend said, you're on a list, you're on a death list, be careful. And he said, well, later on today, I'm going to meet an old colleague from the FSB, Andrei Lugovoy, and his mate, Dmitry Kovton. And he said, don't go. And he said, no, I can trust them. I work with them. They won't hurt me. That's the two just there. That's Alexander and Andrew on the right, Lugovoy, and Kovton on the left-hand side just there. So he met them at the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair, where they poured him a cup of tea. That was the fatal error he had by drinking the tea, because that's where the polonium was, in the Pine Bar. Later checks on crockery, on staff, showed that they'd been exposed to it. Thankfully, they didn't die. The two gentlemen there later went to a lap dancing club where they found traces of the polonium. They also went to watch a football match at the Emirates Stadium in London. They found it there. And actually, they also found it on the aircraft that they'd travelled on. But they went back to Moscow. The Metropolitan Police were allowed to go to Moscow to interview the suspects. One of them was in hospital, bound in bandages head to foot. Could have been absolutely anybody. They did actually interview Lugovoy. But the Russians insisted that they used their tape recorder and their tapes. And when they got back to London, the tapes were blank. Not that they'd admitted the crime, but the tapes were blank. Boris. At this time, Boris was an integral part to this act, this play. He's fallen out with Abramovich over one of those oil deals that I mentioned. And he was found hung in his bathroom at his palatial mansion in Surrey. So that's Boris out the way as well. I want to move now to another incident in a place called Salisbury in England. Salisbury poisoning. A different target this time. That's Mr. Skripal. Sergei, he'd been a senior officer in the Russian military until 2006, when it was discovered that he'd been spying for the British intelligence. He was arrested and charged and sent to prison by a Russian court for spying. In like all best spy films, they did an exchange for him, including the sleeper agent from America, no relation, Anna Chapman, and another 9 agents. That they did a swap, I think, in Berlin, and Sergei was released. He was interviewed for a considerable amount of time, passed the evidence, then he effectively retired to Salisbury, which is a very peaceful cathedral city in England, until one Sunday afternoon, when, with his daughter Yulia, they went to an Italian restaurant in Salisbury, Zizi's, where they had some wine and they had some risotto, and that's them there, got a photograph, having their dinner. That's taken from CCTV footage in the centre of Salisbury a short time later, when they're actually giving some children some bread. They'd taken some bread from the restaurant to feed it to ducks, and they gave it to the children. They're then seen on a bench just there, where people think they're drunk or they're drug addicts. Well, they're not. They're actually suffering from the effects of Novichok, which again is a nerve agent, which when they were rushed to Salisbury District Hospital, it's quite near to Porton Down, which is the British military and government nerve agent research centre, and the doctors at the hospital contacted Porton Down, ran the symptoms past them, and they said they've been attacked with nerve agent. So were some of the children that had accepted the bread, and also an off-duty doctor and nurse that went to their assistance on the bench. They weren't they don't die. I mean, spoiler alert, and you probably know that if you know the story anyway. They don't die. But they're seriously injured. Thankfully, the children, the doctor and nurse recover, but they're not the only victims. I think it's important to say that this is what Mr. Putin said just after Sergei was swapped. And I'll leave you to read it, but I'll read it out. Traitors will kick the bucket. Trust me, these people betrayed their friends, their brothers in arms. Whatever they got in exchange for it, those 30 pieces of silver they were given, they will choke on it. Well, thankfully, due to the medical intervention and the consultants at Salisbury Hospital, they didn't choke on it and they survived. These are the suspects for it. They came across for 48 hours. We've got Ruslan and Alexander. It's pointless you giving their other names because they were aliases. They'd got false documents when they came across. And they came to London for the weekend, and they have a run down to Salisbury like you would do, and they have a walk round, and they have a look at a certain house on a certain housing estate where Sergei lives, and they pop back to London overnight on the Saturday, and they come back on the Sunday, and actually what they do, they smear Novichok on the door handle of the house. That's where it was found. So when Sergei and Yulia go in and out of the house, they're actually getting Novichok on their hands. They were stopping in North London at a hotel on the Saturday night. So over for 2 days, down to Salisbury on the Saturday, a quick walk round. They claim to be tourists when they check with the Russian authorities, but you wouldn't travel all the way to London to Salisbury for a couple of hours and back again to go back the following day. Well, I don't think you would anyway, but that's what they claimed they'd done. They were actually members of the FSB, the rebranded KGB, don't forget. They weren't the only victims. That's Sergeant Nick Bailey. He went to the house wearing gloves, so he protected himself, and he forgot and he scratched his nose, and he found himself. But thankfully, he survived in hospital, but such were the after effects. He had to retire from the police force. But people did die as a result of this attack. That's Dawn Sturgis. She died a couple of months after the attack due to a perfume bottle that her boyfriend, Charlie Rowley, had found in a litter bin a few weeks earlier. And he took that home for her birthday, and when it was her birthday, he gave her the perfume, and she sprayed the perfume on her. but actually what she was spraying on her was Novichok, because the would-be assassins had dumped the bottle of Novichok in a litter bin, a recycling bin, and Charlie, they hadn't got a lot of money, had seen it, and he'd taken it for a surprise present. Charlie was affected by the Novichok, but he survived, but Dawn died very quickly in hospital because she'd effectively covered herself in neat Novichok. It was actually the clean-up later that proved to be a massive job. Ambulances, police cars had to be buried. If you want, one of the ambulances that they replaced actually went to pick Dawn Sturgis up as well, so they were good. The military were called in to clean Salisbury up, and it was a massive military operation to do so. In 2018, after the attack, Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, stood up and pointed the finger at Russia. That was the first time a Prime Minister had done it. Despite the other attacks, she was the first Prime Minister to stand up and point the finger. They put financial checks on Russian companies in England. They sent Russian diplomats out the country. And I think in America, you expelled the diplomats, but you didn't put on the financial checks on companies. That very much is about what happens in England. Boris, I mentioned him, well, of course, he's dead, isn't he? Because he hung himself in his bathroom. But I mentioned that the reason he couldn't go back to Russia was the fact he'd been involved in a potential fraud over Aeroflot. Well, that's the guy that he'd been involved in, another oligarch in Russia. That's Nikolai Glushvenko. You know, the weekend that the assassins or would-be assassins that were in England, London, to go down to Salisbury, well, the Saturday night, he got hung in his kitchen in London, not too far from the hotel where the two Russian assassins were stopping for the night. Now, far be it from me to suggest that they'd hung him, but a British coroner, when he held the inquest a couple of years later, said, it's been made to look like he's taken his own life, but we think he's been killed unlawfully. I've only been able to skim the surface of what I wanted to talk about today. If you do want to look further into it, there's an amazing book called From Russia with Blood, which will tell you all about Putin's activities. If you've got access to the BBC, there's a programme called, and I know you can download them abroad, there's a programme called The Salisbury Poisoning. It's not currently available because there's a national inquiry. Although it's been years ago, the inquiry's only just been done. They've taken it off for a short while until the inquiry's complete. Then it'll be available again, I would think, on BBC streaming. I don't know how many British are in the audience, but I've got a bit of a question for you. I was watching TV when the SAS went into the Iranian embassy. I was watching the World Snooker. Anybody remember who were playing? Okay, that one's fallen flat. It were those two. It was Hurricane Higgins and Cliff Thorburn from Canada, and Cliff Thorburn won 18-16. Ladies and gents, I hope you've enjoyed that very, very quick journey through Russian spies and deaths on the streets of England. Thank you very much indeed.
Got to go where your heart